And good afternoon, and thank you again for being with us. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to America at a Crossroads. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Chazen, and Caroline Kelly, I welcome today's guest, Aaron David Miller, and of course, welcome our extraordinary moderator, Patt Morrison. Thank you both for being with us and sharing your ideas with us. We have only 2 more programs in 2023. This Wednesday, December 13th, we'll welcome Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic, who will discuss A World at War with Warren Olney. Ann Applebaum has won the Pulitzer Prize, more than 1 Booker Award, and every other award you can win as a nonfiction author and journalist. It will be an extraordinary hour and will definitely bring us up to date on something that doesn't get a lot of coverage anymore, and that's the Russia-Ukraine war. So it's a really important hour. Then for our final program in 2023, it's on Wednesday, December 20th, and we'll feature Frank Foer, also of The Atlantic, formerly of the New Republic. He'll be discussing the topic of his newly released book, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. He will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. Hope those of you who are celebrating are having a pleasant Hanukkah. Keep those menorahs shining brightly. The world needs all the light we can produce. Just a word to thank you for your extraordinary response to the email that Zev and Mel and I sent out last Friday asking for donations. We are very appreciative of the generosity and loyalty of our audience. Thank you very much. And now please welcome my friend and esteemed lawyer, a former member of the United States Congress, and most importantly, an esteemed member of our Jews United leadership team, Mel Levine. Mel?
Thank you, Janice, also an esteemed member of our team, along with Zev. And we always remember with great affection David Lair. I'm really delighted to welcome Aaron David Miller with us this evening. I've known, liked, and respected Aaron for over 40 years. Aaron is a highly respected Middle East expert. I think it's fair to say that he's devoted his life to trying to make peace in the Middle East between various parties. Aaron served for 24 years in the Department of State, serving 6 different secretaries of state, all of them on Arab-Israeli issues, including on working behalf of U.S. efforts to broker agreements between Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians, some more successfully than others. He is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and we're very fortunate that he was able to take an hour and join us this evening. As Janice mentioned, Aaron is going to be interviewed by our wonderful Patt Morrison. Patt is both a writer and columnist for the Los Angeles Times, who has shared with several colleagues 2 different Pulitzer Prizes. She not only gets prizes for her work at the Times, but for decades, she has also been a popular broadcast journalist. And for that, she has received 6 Emmys, as well as other very prestigious awards. It made me think of her duality, that she's our own Shohei Ohtani. And with that, I turn it over to Pat.
Well, still waiting for my $700 million contract. Mel, thank you so much for that. I can't think of a kinder comparison. I appreciate it. So, and we want to thank Aaron David Miller for joining us too, indeed, taking that time out to help us analyze what's going on. Aaron, thank you again.
Thank you, Pat.
So many developments in the past week. I'd like to ask you to choose which you think has been the most significant of them, and we'll take it from there.
We're 66 days into probably the worst phase of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I witnessed or have analyzed since its inception. The intimacy of the killing, particularly on October 7, the magnitude of the killing and Israel's response in an effort to eradicate Hamas's military infrastructure above and below ground, kill its senior leadership, and redeem its hostages. As clearly created a frame of a conflict that at the moment, 66 days in, I'm not sure I can divine. And I don't think the Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, reading the best of goat entrails and or coffee grinds could tell you right now how it's going to end. The battlefield, the battle space is being shaped primarily by two combatants. Israel's ambitious strategy, 66 days in, with a clock that is ticking slower in some respects than the political clock, the Biden administration, the vaunted international community, the Arab world. And I think the most intriguing thing about the last week or so is the fact that these two clocks, I suspect, are increasingly out of sync. The Israeli clock is thinking months, because it would take probably longer than that to achieve its military objectives and to end Hamas's sovereignty in Gaza, literally its capacity to govern Gaza, which is an objective shared by the White House. At the same time, the administration's political clock is ticking much, much more slowly. So you have the proposition that the Israeli operational tempo in southern Gaza is thinking months, and the administration clock, given the humanitarian catastrophe and the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths, is thinking weeks. And I suspect between now and year's end, it's going to become much clearer whether or not those clocks are still in sync. And if they're not, what the consequence is going to be. I must say that, again, I cannot emphasize enough, particularly on the Israeli side, the impact of the events of October 7th. I'm not an Israeli, I'm not a Palestinian, but observing the Israeli piece of this, I think that the contract, literally the social contract between the governed and those who govern in Israel, has been severely damaged. That contract is very easy to describe. We will sacrifice our children, ourselves, our lives, and we'll do it with pride and honor to defend the interests of this country. But in exchange for this sacrifice and for this selflessness, you, the government, need to guarantee, or at least do everything you possibly can to guarantee our security, and to quote Bill Clinton from another day, the quiet miracle of a normal life. I think that contract has been broken. And it is on the Israeli side, part and parcel of the trauma that the Israelis have experienced. Palestinian population, as we know, has its own trauma, thousands killed, at least a quarter, maybe more women and children, and a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that will probably burn itself and imprint itself on the next generation of Palestinians. So this is an inflection point. Whether the arc of history can be bent in the right direction in its wake is very unclear, but it will be remembered as a seminal point of departure in modern Middle Eastern history, and certainly in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
You speak of the contract between Israel, its government, and its people, which seemed to be further strained with the news over the last week that Israel actually had possession of the Hamas plans as they were carried out more or less on October 7th, and essentially dismissed them, saying there's no way Hamas could pull off anything like this.
You know, it's funny, and thanks for asking that, Pat. Today I interviewed on the show that I run at Carnegie, a former head of Shin Bet, Ami Ayalon, and the former head of Mossad, Ephraim Halevi. I asked them flat out, why October 7th? Ami went through a long explanation about the political and intelligence failures. Halevi zeroed in on the reality that those observation posts, staffed largely by women, overrun, many killed, and others captured, that the analysis that was done by an Israeli female analyst predicted with frightening clarity both the pace, the character, and the extent of what Hamas had planned. Ami said to us this morning that the prime minister was briefed by the former heads of Shin Bet months ago about the possibilities of an explosion. Whether or not it was coming out of Gaza or the West Bank, of course, is critically important. But there's no doubt that the dots were there in terms of what some analysts anticipated, and the dots were connected in this extraordinary 30-page document called Jericho Walls, or the Walls of Jericho, which was available to Israeli decision makers as early as the spring of 2022. But like so much of intelligence, if you get locked into a conception, as Israelis did in October of 1973 with the Egyptians, that Egypt neither had the capacity nor the intention to launch the bold military operation that Sadat did. The same pattern followed here. It was complacency. It was the inability to believe that Hamas had the capacity, the capability to pull off an operation like this. And to sum it up, one Israeli analyst said, because the primary threat out of Gaza was not a cross-border incursion, it was high trajectory weapons and rockets. One Israeli analyst said, we looked up in the air when we should have been looking straight ahead of us. This will go down because it involves so many civilian deaths and hostages. It will go down probably as a greater intelligence failure than October 73, which ultimately resulted in the resignation not only of the intelligence and security elites, but under pressure, Golda Meir in April of 1974. There will be a political reckoning. How it will come, in what form, and when it will come is very hard to predict.
Another blow to Netanyahu and his government came with news of supposed cash payments in suitcases ferried from Netanyahu's government to Hamas by Qatar officials, which was meant to do what and accomplished what, if in fact it's true?
It is true, and open sources, you didn't need access to classified information. This was not secret. The current government, and even its predecessor, in an effort to preserve stability in Gaza and essentially to prefer Hamas, which ruled Gaza, as you know, since 2007, to instability, and lulled into complacency by the fact that Hamas appeared to be placing more emphasis on actually ruling in Gaza. They were negotiating with the Israelis within the last month before the attack for an increase of Palestinian workers to work in Israel. So it was, yes, the Qataris with cash in suitcases, facilitated either by Mossad or Shin Bet, delivered anywhere from $3 to $20 million a month to Hamas. And for the Netanyahu government, this also had to carry the added advantage of essentially benefiting from a divided Palestinian national movement. Since Arafat died, the Palestinian national movement literally resembles Noah's Ark. There are two of everything: two constitutions, two sets of security services. You have Hamasistan in Gaza, and the PLO-PA, Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas's 40% of the West Bank that he controls. Two sets of patrons and two visions between Hamas and Fatah, Abbas's party, of where Palestine is supposed to be and what it's supposed to be. And as far as the prime minister was concerned, this three-state solution a small Palestinian enclave in Gaza controlled by Hamas, Abbas in control of 40% of the West Bank, and Israel, the three-state solution virtually guaranteed that there would be no serious pressure on the part of Palestinians to push this Israeli government, or even its predecessor, toward meaningful negotiations toward a political horizon or an end state to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So yes, I think that's an added responsibility and an added intelligence failure. They miss the whole Hamas deception that by creating the smoke screen of maintenance in Gaza, more workers, better relations with the Egyptians, that this covered this galactic play, this cosmic roll of the dice in the October 7 operation.
There are other factors that are imposing external pressure on what's going on. I want to get to them later. The Houthis firing on ships in the Red Sea, the question of Lebanon on the border in the West Bank. But we also have internally in Gaza a humanitarian crisis that's now extended to food, water, perhaps communicable diseases. Southern Gaza, the massing of people who were told, go south, you're going to be all right. And that's turning out not to be the case. And the kind of emotional pressure that you're seeing out in the world being brought to bear, and whether or not that factors into Israel's operations at all.
Look, there are at least several wars being waged, right? I mean, there's the battlefield space, and then there's the war of ideas. And I don't think you have to be a brilliant analyst to conclude that 66 days in, it's no longer even a split screen. October 7 and the sadistic, indiscriminate, cruel nature of the killings on one screen, and the humanitarian catastrophe and the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths, again, a fair percentage women and children, in the other screen. It's become one screen. And the information space, it seems to me, to be dominated largely in most of the world, including the United States to some extent, actually maybe to a larger extent than any of us would care to recognize. The information space is being dominated by the Palestinian narrative. And let me be clear about something. It is magical thinking, truly magical thinking, to believe that Israel's objectives in Hamas, again, I'll repeat them, to degrade, if not eradicate, Hamas's military infrastructure above ground and below ground. That's 15 to 25,000 fighters, to destroy the tunnel infrastructure, roughly 300 kilometers, half the length of the New York subway system, and kill its senior leadership, particularly the top three, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, and Marwan Issa, the three military chiefs, the architects of October 7th. That is their objective. It is virtually impossible for them to pursue that objective in a space roughly twice the size of the District of Columbia, with 2.3 million people, 1.8 million of which are now constrained and contained in a fifth, maybe a quarter of Gaza's 363 square kilometers, with a population of human to square mile anywhere from 20,000 to 36,000 humans per square mile. It's impossible to pursue those objectives without inflicting grievous injury on Palestinian civilians. And I would argue to you that one of the reasons that the Biden administration doesn't have the kind of leverage it might have exerted on Israel is that the Biden administration cannot come up with more compelling answers to how to address those irreconcilable objectives. Eradicating Hamas, which the president shares Israel's war objectives on one hand, with minimizing Palestinian deaths on the other. I interviewed David Petraeus a couple weeks ago. I asked him the question. I mean, he wouldn't answer it directly because I think he didn't want to give the answer. Fallujah was a fifth the size of Gaza. It took him 5 days at a cost of 75 Marines, and they killed 2,200 fighters to deal with that problem. This is something that international humanitarian law was never designed to address. How do you actually pursue a military campaign in such a densely populated urban environment when Hamas is embedding its military assets in and around? The administration has offered all kinds of suggestions. Change the ordinance. Don't drop 1,000, 2,000 pound iron bombs as the Israelis did during the 3 weeks of airstrikes, 2 weeks of airstrikes before the ground campaign began. Try targeted military operations. But if in fact your goal is to at least degrade and debilitate Hamas's military capacity so it loses its sovereignty in Gaza, and that is the objective. It's not just a military objective. Eliminating Hamas as an organization is virtually impossible. The thousands of doctors, lawyers, public officials, teachers that Hamas has employed since 2007 to run Gaza, even if a third of those are Hamas loyalists, actually ascribe to Hamas's ideology, the fact is, if in fact the Israelis could cripple Hamas's military capacity, and you got some sort of transitional mechanism into Gaza to secure law and order and surge humanitarian assistance with the thought at some point of bringing back Palestinian governance with a lot of money from the Europeans and the Arabs, it probably is an achievable goal. It's just, it cannot be achieved in a matter of weeks. And that's the real problem. So I've struggled with this for the last 60 plus days. The Israelis are not willfully and intentionally trying to kill civilians. Of that, I'm clear. Have the Israeli rules of engagement on the two key issues of international humanitarian law, distinction and proportionality, have those rules of engagement broadened? Are they much looser? Based on the results, I think the answer is absolutely. And again, I come back to the central problem of how you prosecute these war aims in an urban environment in which there are so many innocents in the field of battle as well. It does not have an answer.
There are millions of people in the world who think that the White House is calling the shots in Israel. You see and hear it from a lot of protesters domestically, and the veto in the United Nations of the ceasefire motion certainly tended to cement some of this in people's minds. And yet, as you've alluded to, the Biden administration has been playing to several different audiences here, trying to deal with catastrophe, with war, and with domestic issues all at once, and has been having, you early on argued that it had done a good job balancing, but is this balance slipping out of its control?
Well, it's not. Is it really balanced? I mean, we have a special relationship with the state of Israel. I've dealt with this issue for decades in terms of the negotiations, all right? In 2005, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post, and I resurrected a phrase out of Kissinger's memoir, in which he said he wasn't going to be Israel's lawyer. I mean, the fact is, we have this special relationship with Israel. When we use it effectively, lease negotiations, and it doesn't become an exclusive relationship, we can actually be quite effective. When it comes to this particular crisis, I don't think you could underestimate the importance of presidential persona. Joe Biden, and again, the presidential model here is not Barack Obama. Presidential model for Joe Biden is Bill Clinton. Though a generation apart, each of them has an extraordinary bond I would even argue, I'd use the word love of the idea of Israel, love for the Israeli people, not for the Netanyahu government, for sure. I mean, Clinton wrote in his memoirs, I loved Rabin, the late Prime Minister Rabin, as I rarely loved any man. That's an extraordinary statement for a president of the United States to make. Joe Biden, alone among American presidents, feels himself, believes that he is part of the Israeli story. It's not coincidental that in the first 10 days of the war, he went to Israel. So Biden's love of Israel, his regard for Israel, his capacity to give Israel the benefit of the doubt is deeply imprinted on his emotional and his political DNA. The frame that Biden fabricated, conceived in that October 10 speech, which is one of the most powerful and emotional of his presidency, was basically this: we're going to give Israel the time, the space, and the support to do what it thinks it needs to be done with respect to Hamas. That frame has evolved in response to the humanitarian catastrophe, in response to the killing of so many Palestinians, and the reaction at home from within his own party, from the American public, from the region, from the international community. It's evolved, there's no doubt. But the frame, in my judgment, more or less remains the same. It's not our war. I gave a talk the other day at the Aspen Security Forum, and I stuck around to listen to John Feiner, the Deputy National Security Advisor. It's not our war, Feiner said. We have influence, but we're not fighting this war. Implicitly, still, even though I've referred to the fact that the Biden clock is ticking faster than the IDF operational clock, the frame, it seems to me, is still quite whole with regard to supporting the Israelis. I mean, it seems unmistakable to me. I mean, this week it was reported, the decision was announced at 11 p.m. Friday night, that the administration was, again, using the president's emergency powers under the Export Control Act to basically surge to the Israelis 13,000 tank munitions out of a total package of 45,000, which will have to be reviewed by Congress. And the veto, with the Brits abstaining, everyone else voting for, of the Security Council resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, again, it is evidence of the fact that the administration still shares Israel's ultimate war objectives. Tactics, perhaps not so much, but as we mentioned before, Pat, if the administration can't come up with a better answer to how you prosecute this war without killing civilians, or the other question, how do you create humanitarian surging of assistance in the Gaza in a free fire zone? The administration doesn't have a better answer on that one either. And because they don't have better answers, I think their leverage and their influence in pushing the Israelis one way or another, I think, is much reduced. Is there a moment of truth coming in the U.S.-Israeli relationship when Joe Biden picks up the phone and says to Benjamin Netanyahu, enough. This has to stop.
And he said maybe it's time to consider conditions on aid.
He's already got members of his own party, and not just progressive Democrats, but people like Chris Murphy and Chris Van Hollen, who are already moving in that direction. Again, I think the administration's calculation, and I have my own context and sources, but just from my own analysis, if by January, we're 3 weeks away, if by January, the most intense kinetic part of the Israeli military campaign, the artillery, the airstrikes in southern Gaza, doesn't enter another phase, I mean, I'll pose it as a question. Will the administration use the unbelievable leverage that this president has acquired as a consequence of his extraordinary support for Israel in the wake of October 7th. That's the core question. I mean, I think I would probably know the answer to that question, but let's just see how it plays out.
Getting a lot of questions about the zone of acceptability for Israel for a solution, including would a solution where Israel agrees to a ceasefire in return for the release of all hostages, the establishment of a multinational force to govern Gaza. Where is that zone of plausibility for bringing this to an end?
Well, bringing it to an end. I mean, it's not going, if you're talking about bringing to an end this intense phase of Israel's military operation.
I think that's what most people are looking at.
I mean, I think that would follow the course of Israel's own sort of military strategy. But bringing it to an end in the sense that somehow there'll be a mission accomplished speech given, somehow the Israelis will essentially draw down all of their forces in Gaza and depart with no sense of who's going to fill in after them. I think that's not going to happen. The Israelis will probably remain operational in Gaza for months to come. And in addition to that, even though the administration has warned no reduction in territory, I have absolutely no doubt. And, you know, with all due respect to the Oracle at Delphi, this is one prediction that I'm willing to make, that the Israelis will create on the Gazan side of the border in the north and the east, and a buffer zone. They'll go to great lengths to say it's not permanent. We have no desire for permanent occupation. I believe that to be the case, but their military operations will not end. If they manage in the next month or so to capture or kill Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and Marwan Issa, that would be a huge accomplishment. It would be one metric that they could use to explain to the people of Israel exactly why this 60, 70, 80-day campaign was actually worthwhile. We've got 1,500 Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF reported yesterday, Haaretz reported, wounded, and probably in conjunction with October 7th, several hundred or more Israeli deaths, military troops that have died. So I don't think there's going to be an end state, because a multinational force seems to me almost impossible. An Arab deterrent force, Arab boots on the ground, seems unlikely without a clear understanding. Forget mandates in the UN Security Council. I doubt if you can get any sort of international force with UN legitimacy through the Security Council, given the vagaries of our relations with Russia and China right now. I mean, they have the veto power. But a coalition of the willing, as Macron had suggested, outside of the UN Security Council, I don't think anybody is going to agree to put any boots on the ground, let alone the United States, unless there is a clear understanding that Gaza first is not Gaza only. That is to say, there is a recognition that what we're doing in Gaza creates and provides a pathway, as bizarre and surreal and as fantastical as it may appear, to a political endgame. And the least worst solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is separation through negotiations. If October 7th demonstrated anything with a terrifying clarity, it is that Israelis and Palestinians cannot, either in one state or a binational state, live together happily ever after under one roof. At the same time, the odds of moving quickly to such an end state, it seems to me, are slim to none, and Slim has already left town.
And-
Two traumatized publics with weak leaders under enormous constraints, particularly on the Israeli side, and no structured way, no elections, no public protests are going to essentially remove Mahmoud Abbas, who is now in the 19th year of a 4-year term, with no credibility, from power. But out there somewhere is in my judgment, the answer to this. Long, dark tunnel right now, seemingly no way out. But again, inflection points create all kinds of uncertainties and unpredictabilities. So that would be the key to getting a huge investment by the Arabs, by the Europeans, some commitment that what we're doing in Gaza is not done in a vacuum. It's tethered to a rational, logical approach that would make another October 7 impossible.
On the other hand, it seems like the longer this goes on, the more temptation there is for other elements to come into this, whether it's Hezbollah or the Houthi attack on vessels in the Red Sea, and the destabilization or 3D chess, however you want to put it, that these elements and the United States expected or maybe anticipated response to them might invite. Does that make it a whole new ballgame, or is it a sideshow?
You're a really good interview of that. I mean,
Thank you.
The way you structure these questions and the flow is just really impressive. Look, if you want to reframe this conflict completely, if you want to make Gaza look like, by comparison, that it is a minor police action, then create a situation. And I'm fearful of this. I wouldn't predict it yet, but create a situation where you activate in a serious way the Northern Front. That changes and reframes the entire conflict in so many ways. The summer of 2006, in an effort in response to the taking of a couple Israeli soldiers, the Olmert government launched a major campaign, and to use the former prime minister's words, to quote unquote eradicate Hezbollah. It ended up in a situation where for 34 days, Hezbollah, with relatively unsophisticated high trajectory weapons, shut down the northern half of the Middle East's most preeminent military power for more than a month. Hezbollah now has estimated anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 high trajectory weapons of varying range, lethality, and precision. Estimated they could launch several thousand a day and 6,000 to 8,000 if they wanted to surge. The Israeli response to this, and the Israelis have had 17 years to figure out what it is they were going to do, is going to be a variation of what they call the Dahya Doctrine, which is the southern suburbs of Beirut. It will mean a destruction of Lebanese infrastructure. It will mean the deaths of thousands of Lebanese, but it will not be contained. We have 2 carrier strike groups in the Eastern Med, 200 carrier strike aircraft. The temptation and pro-Iranian militias striking 77 times since October 17. Pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria have targeted American bases, including the Green Zone in Baghdad. Injuries, no deaths, with the exception of, I think, one American contractor had a heart attack and died. You kill 15, 16 Americans, the United States will target Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps elements, and here you get the possibility of serious escalation. Neither Tehran nor Hezbollah, why would they want to join right now? Hamas is doing everything that they wanted to do. They've got the entire international community clawing at the Israelis. They've got the Biden administration trying to figure out, how do we reconcile our support with Israel with our diminished credibility in the region. They've got the Israeli-Saudi normalization process on hold. And they've got Israel stuck in Gaza and Israel stuck in the West Bank, which is exactly where Tehran wants the Israelis. And in a way, it's working. Hamas rolled the dice on October 7th. They really did. It was a cosmic roll of it was not Sadat inflicting a limited military defeat on Israel in October 73, so he could attach himself to Kissinger and the Nixon administration and ultimately throw the Russians out and go to Jerusalem and make peace with Menachem Begin. No, Hamas wanted to provoke, it wanted to radicalize, it wanted to inflict a level of pain, degradation, and suffering on Israeli civilians that went beyond anything that we witnessed, even during the worst of the suicide terror on Israeli civilians, particularly on Israeli women, which raises the whole question of the 20 women that Hamas holds and won't return, a portion of which I think are being held by other groups. And this is, so why would Iran want to risk a major confrontation with all that firepower in the Eastern Med or Hezbollah? They don't want it. There's a problem, though, for the Israelis, because they've relocated 150,000 Israelis from the Gaza envelope communities in the south and from the border communities in the north. When are those people when will they go back? It's more evidence that the social contract between the government and this Israeli government has kind of broken down. They can't not be returned to their homes forever. And the Israelis are laying red lines down now. Hamas must move beyond the Litani River, another 10, 18 miles north of where some of Hezbollah's assets are now. And there was a point in the first week in this conflict in which the Israelis were prepared to preempt. And one of the three things the Biden administration actually deserves credit for, it was preventing that from taking place. So the risk of an escalation in the north is, I think, serious. It will largely depend, I think, on Israel's ground campaign in the north. But again, my bottom line is that Hezbollah and Iran will fight the Israelis to the last Palestinian. They do not want to compromise their assets right now.
We have questions from our viewers, and I want to combine a couple, Ruth and Ron and Victor. Ruth and Ron wanting to know whether this is creating more terrorists and radicalization. And Victor says, do you think that Gaza bears responsibility for Hamas since they let them to stay in power, which really lays out two paths. One is a more radicalized Gaza, and the other is a Gaza that essentially says, we've thrown off the chains and now we can have elections. We can choose, again, a government more to our liking.
I mean, you know, the notion that 2.3 million people, half of whom are under the age of 18, somehow are all Hamas loyalists, strikes me as fantastical. Polls that were done in the summer and right up to October, through October 8th, suggest that a majority of Gazans were really adamantly opposed to Hamas's form of governance, very disappointed in social services, economic opportunity, and the like. So I think if Hamas's sovereignty could be ended in Gaza, if the roots of Hamas's, if the environment in Gaza could somehow be fundamentally improved, security for Gazans, broadening of economic horizons, aid and trade. You're not going to turn Gaza into Singapore in the Mediterranean, but there's got to be a way. I mean, 363 square kilometers, there's got to be a way to improve the fortunes of the humans who live there. And I think it's possible. I think it's possible. It's just that it's very hard to see how you get from where we are now, even if this intense kinetic phase of Israel's military campaign comes to an end. It's still very hard to see how you stabilize Gaza without some sort of governing force. And that, I think, is going to be, that's the proverbial day after. And it's complicated, as I mentioned, because Gaza first cannot be Gaza only. You'll only get buy-in, certainly from the Arabs after what they've witnessed, and more than likely from the Europeans, if in fact you construct some sort of pathway which points people in the direction of where this is headed. And the Biden administration, I mean, who else is going to own this? The president several weeks ago said there's no going back to status quo on October 6th. I'm not sure Joe Biden really understood the import of what he was saying, because that means that the US has got to step up during 2024. And 2024 is the strategic imperative here. I mean, look, I've worked for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Democrats and Republicans, but let me be very clear here. If I hadn't said it yet, I'm going to say it now. There is no foreign policy issue out there. Not a rising China, not Putin's aggression in Ukraine, not Khamenei's pursuit of a nuclear weapon, and certainly not the Israeli-Hamas conflict that presents a greater threat to the future of this republic than a victory by the presumptive Republican nominee. So if I thought, full confessions here, if I thought that Joe Biden was on the cusp of launching a major effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I thought that somehow that would open him up to vulnerability in 2024, I'd use the same line I just used for you. Governing's about choosing. And in 2024, foreign policy is figuring, as George Will said, for most of the American public, they want as little of foreign policy as possible. Will this election turn on what Joe Biden does in Ukraine or doesn't do? How badly has he been hurt with young Americans, Arab Americans, in terms of his support for Israel? A year is an eternity in American politics. I know I've drifted off the highway here in terms of answering your question.
Well, there was a question about what kind of policy you think we would have if Trump were to be restored to the Oval Office in 2024.
Well, I think that's an easy one. I mean, I worked for Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. Politics is always a part of foreign policy. But let's be clear, in no administration that I ever worked for was a president's personal vanity and persona and political needs and requirements more central to the management, to the governing, domestic governance and foreign policy. I mean, I still believe in something called the national interest, in which Republican and Democratic presidents, for the good of the republic, rise above their own narrow political concerns to make judgments and decisions based on what is actually good, reasonable, and sound for the United States. I mean, there were certainly instances in the Trump presidency that Trump deserves credit for, the Abraham Accords being one. But you have to look, in the end, the president's administration is about finding the balance, right? So whatever credit is due to the presumptive Republican nominee, the reality is, what were the downsides of his administration? And in essence, what are the challenges and threats should he become president again? I don't worry so much about foreign policy. I spent my whole life worrying about foreign policy and the Middle East. I'm now more worried for my children about the future of this republic and whether or not self-governance is possible you've got two political parties. You cannot have one of those parties essentially coloring way outside the lines of what constitutes the basic norms and institutions of American governance. You can't have 30% of the country ascribing to a whole different set of empirical data and facts and expect to have reasonable self-governance. Because if there's no truth, if we can't agree on basic facts and on basic truths, that opens the door to the man or woman who wants to ride in and tell you exactly what the truth is. You cannot have that effective self-governance. And that's what I'm afraid we're sort of driving toward. I have great faith in the Republic, in its recuperative powers, its powers to regenerate. But 2020 was a huge stress test. 2024 may well be, and I realize what I'm about to say, there have been many consequential elections in the history of this country. 2024 may well be the most consequential election.
Let me get to, in the little time we have left, a couple more questions. Eric has asked a question that we often hear, which is, given that we saw, for example, after the Russians invaded Ukraine, that there were other nations who took the refugees, principally Poland. So why is it in this situation, other countries in the Mideast, Egypt, Jordan, are not taking Gaza refugees the way that you might expect them to do, given the dire circumstances in Gaza, which are only getting more dire?
The uniqueness of the refugee issue in Middle Eastern politics and the national interest, particularly of Egypt. I mean, Egypt and Israel are critically important to what will happen in Gaza. They control entrance. They control the three checkpoints, 3 passageways, 4 on the Israeli side, Rafah on the Egyptian side. When you talk about Palestinian refugees, the resonance among Palestinians is incredibly emotional. So you have the Nakba, right, the disaster in 1948. You have the Naksa, the refugee flow that followed the 1967 war. You have the great fear of Palestinians, certainly on the West Bank, that the most extreme right-wing, supremacist, homophobic government in the history of the state of Israel, this government, particularly 2 ministers who have big budgets, big agendas, and who are ideologues, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, it has certainly crossed their minds that under the cover of Gaza, they are creating a situation in the West Bank. You have entire shepherding communities, roughly almost 1,000 people, forced off of their land as a consequence of intimidation by Israeli settlers. So the fear that Palestinians have of leaving and the fear that the Arabs have of Palestinians coming is enough to answer your question. The notion that Egypt would take hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, this is the Sisi government, right? This is one of the most nationalist, authoritarian governments in Egypt's history. Sisi has made it unmistakably clear, and he'll have Egyptian public opinion on his side. They don't like Hamas. Hamas was created as an offshoot of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, in 1987. They don't trust Hamas. Sisi came after Mohammed Morsi, a Muslim Brotherhood president, and Morsi came to power in a popular-backed coup. There's no way the Egyptians would ever take hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, even if it was on a temporary basis. And for Palestinians, there is no temporary basis. Leaving Gaza means, and they may be right, let's be clear, I wouldn't put it past several ministers in this government to basically believe that somehow they can reduce the population of Gaza by creating a situation in which the Egyptians have no choice in southern Gaza and Rafah, but to allow masses of Palestinians to cross the border.
And it's a one-way turnstile.
It's a one-way turnstile. And the Jordanians are as apoplectic as I've ever seen them because of the large Palestinian majority in Jordan and the king's clear fear that with this government, displacement, forced displacement, is a very real possibility. So I would be stunned if the Egyptians decided, forget the security issues that it would pose for them, to allow significant numbers of Palestinians, even thousands who are in dire need of crossing that border to take up residence somewhere in Sinai, or Sinai, or even close in camps proximate to the border.
We have 5 minutes. I'd like you to spend 2 of them on my penultimate question to size up the Kissinger legacy. He just died a couple of weeks ago at the age of 100 after a very long tenure in government and diplomacy.
I mean, look, he is one of the most admired humans in the foreign policy space. I interviewed him for one of my books. I would answer the question this way: getting anything done in government, anything, is unbelievably hard. That is not fully appreciated from anyone who has not spent time in policy, where the choice is often not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. That Kissinger managed to accomplish what he accomplished, with all of the asterisks, the downsides, the disrespect for human rights, Cambodia, stalling on Vietnam in '73, leading to the deaths of thousands more of American GIs. All of that is right. And, you know, I don't think Kissinger believed he would live so long that all of these documents would ultimately be declassified. But in my part of the world, 3 disengagement agreements in 18 months, 2 with Israel and Egypt, 1 with Syria. The longest time an American Secretary of State has spent outside of the United States, 33 days on the Israeli-Syrian shuttle, paving the way for what would become a transformative Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Not that it transformed relations between Israel and Egypt, but it transformed the security reality in the Middle East. After that peace treaty, there could never be another 2-front war, not between states.
Oh.
I'm the state of Israel. So, you know, in my view, with all the downsides, Kissinger got an enormous amount done, and a lot of it was good.
Maybe it's his world and we just live in it. So, Aaron, for the last question, we ask in memory of our late co-founder David Lehrer to give us something positive to hold on to as you leave us, and I hope you will come back again to talk.
For sure. And Pat, let me just thank you and Janice and Zev and Mel and Merrick at Crossroads for giving me this opportunity. It was very special. You know, I'll end on a positive note because I have no alternative. I have 2 grown children. I occupy a tiny space on the planet for a very short period of time. I can't live, Elie Wiesel was right, without hope, there's no life. On October 6, 1973, coming out of Yom Kippur services in Jerusalem, my wife Lindsay and I, on our way back to our apartment, about 2 p.m., we heard the sirens wail. And for the next several weeks, I got a chance to go to Sinai after the ceasefire was declared. And I saw the trauma of the largest tank engagements since the end of the Second World War, and a nation that was traumatized, 2,800 Israelis dead and countless Syrians and Egyptians. But within 6 years of that trauma, I watched Sadat Begin and Carter sign an Egyptian treaty of peace on the White House lawn. 20 years later, so in that case, trauma turned to hope. 20 years later, I'm sitting on the White House lawn again, September 13th, 1993, watching Clinton force that handshake between Arafat and Rabin. And I'm thinking, you know, in one of the most galactic misjudgments of my career, and there have been several big ones, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was over. We get there. Sooner or later, we get there. And in that case, hope turns to trauma. So what do I make of this? Trauma to hope in 73, and hope to trauma in 93. Here's my takeaway, and I believe it and I live it. The arc of history bends in ways that we do not know. Pat, you don't know, and I don't know. It bends in very strange and unpredictable ways. And I take some comfort in that. Hope isn't enough. I mean, you've got to work to try to see whether or not you can bend that arc in the right direction. I'd only say one last thing. Jack Kennedy was the first and last president who ever had an emotional impact on me. I was 12 when he was assassinated. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. I borrowed that. That's where America should be. That's where our foreign policy should be. That's where I am. Never giving up on the prospect that you can be changed, your family, your community, the nation, the world can be changed for the better. But as you go through the process of change, you're impelled to go through it with your eyes wide open. Idealism without illusion.
I'd like to end on that. Thank you, Aaron David Miller, so much. And again, I hope you will come back to join us once more. And on Wednesday, you can hear from Ann Applebaum speaking with Warren Olney, talking about A World at War. We hope you'll join us for that then again this coming Wednesday. And thank you for joining us this evening.